Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have as our guest Adel El Mahrouky. He's coming to us from Egypt, where Adel teaches at the Kamal Adams Center for Television and Journalism, which is affiliated with the American University in Cairo. For about 14 years, he's been freelance journalist with CGTN. This is the Chinese affiliated network throughout the region and throughout the world. And what we're going to talk about with Adel today is the way that China and the US try to influence the Arab world through the media and through other cultural affairs related to the media. Since Adel has been a journalist for so long throughout the region, and he has so much experience dealing with these issues on both sides, it'll be interesting to hear his perspective, an Arab perspective, on the soft power competition between China and the United States in the Middle East. With that, I'd like to turn over to Adel and just ask a very general, very broad question, Adel. What is your perception? What's your impression of the efforts that the US and China make in the region to try and sway hearts and minds through the media?
Thank you, Josh, for having me. So basically, when you look at it, you need to look at how both are portraying their news content or their media coverage of the region. And I believe there's a core difference between how both have approached the Arab world, or maybe even the world. So if you take a look at like famous international channels from the United States, like CNN International, MSNBC's international broadcast, and so on, that's not only for the States, but if we also portray that to Europe as well, you find the same principle that I'm about to explain, and that is mainly you have journalists who are citizens of that country reporting on the Arab world, which more or less puts it in their own perspective. So it's basically the United States or Europe saying how they portray specific issues in the Middle East through their international channels. While when China decided to make CGTN, it was CCTV back then, part of the government-owned network. And when they came to rebrand it as CGTN, I'm talking around 2010, 2011, they decided to take a different approach. And that is mainly, so I'm talking mainly, not like 100% of the coverage is this way and on both sides. But their perspective was that mainly they want to get people, local nationals, who would report on their own story. So it is, in a way, each country saying its own narrative rather than having CGTN getting Chinese reporters narrating these stories from their perspective. Of course, there are like general, broad policy that at the end of the day, this is a government-owned channel, for example, when it comes to CGTN. But you'll find like strong affiliation to the general foreign policy of either countries, whether it's the United States or CGTN. And in that regard, that's what like a core foundation or a core difference about how both countries have decided to cover the news from this region in a different way.
I'm teaching a class on China and the Middle East right now at a local college in the DC area. And it's one of the things you read about the period after 9/11, when the Chinese first started doing media outreach in the region. One of the things you read in the literature is how the approach of the Americans and the approach of the Chinese was so very different. The Chinese were working on getting interviews and documentaries done through Al Jazeera so that they could have local reporters in a local face presenting information and facts about China and what China's perspective is. Whereas the Americans were setting up Al Hura and having a lot of US-based, US-affiliated voices, then active, putting out a very pro-Western line. And there was certainly an advantage for the Chinese to be able to work through a local implementer that had credibility and legitimacy on the ground in that period of the mid-2000s and the late 2000s. Do you feel that when the Chinese set up CCTV, now CGTN, that it maintained the same type of momentum they were trying to create by working through the local partners? Do you think that having CGTN as an independent network, even with the Arab faces that present on it, do you feel that's an aid or a hindrance to the Chinese getting their message across?
So I think it definitely helps in a way because you're seeing familiar faces um, speaking basically the language. Even the English would have the accent of the common English accent in that region, you know. So everything looks familiar, everything sounds familiar. So that's a very important aspect. Even, for example, if you take a look at CGTN Africa, and CGTN was basically one of the very first um, media entities to have dedicated newscasts for Africa stories. So you had full 1 hour, several of these shows a day, only focusing on business, sports, and of course, news stories coming from Africa. And then we've seen other networks started having like their own Africa programs because that's the way to go. But even in CGTN Africa, you'd find that the main focus of the presenters or how they look Africans, they speak Africans. The English does not have to be like an American accent or a British accent. It's just a regular English accent of what is dominant across the continent. So that makes it familiar. So in a way, that is quite effective. Also, when it comes to dictating the angle, you have a nationalistic view. So also another very core difference between the United States and China is that China from its perspective, believes in non-interference in political affairs or in national affairs of countries. So you will not find China pointing the finger and saying more human rights, less human rights, more business openness or capitalistic approach or even communistic approach. You know, that is something that is clear through the media. And therefore, the content of the Chinese owned media, CGTN, namely here, tends to have a more of a friendly tone to the national countries it's reporting about. On the contrast, you have the United States and its channels, CNN, for example, easily can be like poking into human rights issues which might upset, you know, the government of a specific country. That will not be the case because China believes that the purpose of the new, this is of course my interpretation, that the purpose of that media outlet is to highlight how cooperation with China can yield positive results, how it can be win-win, how South-to-South cooperation in a bigger scope is or should be the next coming trend and should be widespread. And this is quite clear in the content in CGTN, for example. So you'd see highlights over the positive economic impacts, the projects that are ongoing. You'd hear voices, local voices talking about their own issues. And I think all of that in that regard, in a way, has made CGTN, it has a good base. Of course, there's still space for CGTN to catch up in terms of viewership or influence. But throughout the past 14 years, as you mentioned, I've been working with them. At first, people would ask, what is CCTV or what is CGTN? But now it is quite famous. It is quite known. Oh, yes, when I go to the hotel, I look for it. It is now common for me to meet people who say, we watch CGTN at least on a weekly basis. And to me, that is a surprise that the influence, it is growing. It is not booming, but it's gradually growing in a steady pace that is now being reached in most parts of the region.
So then tell me, as someone who has reported from all over the Middle East, you've reported from places I could never dream of going to. Um, has your affiliation with CGTN opened doors for you? Has it allowed you to do the types of interviews you might not normally be able to do if you were affiliated with a Western news outlet?
Yeah. So let me give you an example of Egypt back in 2013. Was a time when the Egyptian armed forces decided to respond to popular movements calling for the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi back then, to be ousted or removed from power. The military intervened. And then at a certain time after June 30th in 2013, there were two massive parties in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic movement, and their supporters, they're camping in the streets, they're protesting in several areas of Cairo. And on the other hand, those who are calling for the military to continue ousting the Muslim Brotherhood. So both are camped, separate locations, and so on. At that time, you would not find for example, CNN being welcomed in Tahrir Square, where the people who wants the military to help them, or from their perspective, of course, to be allowed in with their cameras or being interviewed. You'd find if they see the live stream getting Al Jazeera covering Tahrir Square with their laser pointers, they would chase the cameras until they locate Al Jazeera camera and try to at least blur its coverage from Tahrir Square. Same would happen with different channels at Rabaa, where the Muslim Brotherhoods, their supporters have been there. And from that perspective, you'd find CGTN clearly has not been affiliated to either parties at that time. And it's mainly because of the content itself. CGTN did not take sides in that political battle that was ongoing in the country. CGTN did not choose one side over the other. It was actually pretty meticulous. It was a journalistic dream at that time of extreme, unbiased and having equal sides coming on the screen. So you would have reports coming from Rabaa, where the Muslim Brotherhoods are, reports coming from Tahrir Square, where the military supporters are. And if there's one soundbite from that, there should be another soundbite to balance it out. It was pretty meticulous, the coverage of CGTN at that time. And as a person who was reporting for CGTN at this very critical period in Egyptian politics, my camera was allowed to go both sides. At the time, I knew clearly that some channels were not allowed here and other channels were not allowed on the other side.
So then let's go back to the American side of things. I mean, American news networks have had a lot of time and many years in order to figure out how to get things right in messaging the Middle East and working in the Middle East. What is still lacking? What do they not understand, these networks, in terms of connecting with viewers and creating a market?
So you need to understand that there are a lot of commonalities between the Middle East, the Arab world, and China in specific in terms of having an Oriental background. So there is the cultural aspect, the family aspect, the social aspect of it, the idea of pride, for example. Many cultural heritage, if I may say, that more or less describes the Orient or the East in general. And when it comes to the media, you'd find that more or less affiliated with CGTN and the Arab world. So, for example, if specific topics are frowned upon in the Arab world, you'd find more or less the same topics are frowned upon on CGTN. When it comes to the West, and this is where your question comes in, people would feel that there is a cultural difference, there is a gap. So topics that may be frowned upon in the Arab world would be openly discussed on American television. And if it is in Arabic language, for example, as Al-Hurra would do, then this would be considered like a direct interference into social norms, for example. And this is something that is a big gap between both sides. And so in a way you'd feel, or at least people would feel, that US media would say, this is the right thing to do stuff. This is the right belief to follow. And more or less is being spread or in a way perceived as imposed on viewers watching this content, while on the other side, in CGTN, for example, you would not feel the same, what is considered to be maybe imposement or interference in social norms, for example. And this is one side of it. The other side is that the political system, the political belief, and whether one country, as I talked earlier, or media outlets would be discussing about things that would be considered sensitive in that regard. Of course, it comes a debate about what is the role of the media in that part. But again, we're talking about what would people, or most people would see, and what would most people want to hear. And in that regard, you may find like the elites, people, first of all, who are educated in a certain way. They have multiple languages that they can speak, and therefore, and have liberal mindset, would be open to look to both sides or even choose the United States over the Chinese media. But yet again, when it comes to specifically, is that who we are, or what we want our kids, for example, to be watching or seeing? This would maybe become a conflict later on.
There is an aspect of journalism in which your network is reaching out to audiences in the region to try and explain the world from a perspective that is at least friendly or accommodating towards China. But there's also an aspect of journalism in which your work and your presentation and your abilities also have a role to play back home in China. Do you feel that CGTN and what they do in the Middle East is changing perceptions of China itself? And do you think it's doing it in a way that supports the policies and goals of the government back in Beijing?
Well, definitely, there's no contradiction between what is being broadcasted on CGTN and the policies of the Chinese government. Or even you would not find any contradictions of what is being broadcasted on CGTN and the policies of local governments it is covering. So that is like what you would find in the content. There is this highlight of, as I said earlier, cooperation and how it reflects on the economy and the people of the two countries. But at the same time, if I'm working, for example, I mean, throughout the past 14 years, I cannot say I have found interference into the content of the script that I write. Maybe at one time, for example, during the uprising in Syria, where the Arabs and the Arab League have expelled Syria from its membership and not recognizing Bashar al-Assad as president, but as foreign policy and as China relations, Bashar al-Assad was still president. So I could not say depose President al-Assad, or I would have to say President Bashar al-Assad, which is basic, foreign policy coordination between the government and its own media. But that I mean, and to me, that's not a major incident, But overall, CGTN and its content and how I've seen working with it, we do have a great space to work, a great liberty to produce our work. And it's also because people managing CGTN understand that they are competing with other networks, because this is an English-speaking channel, and therefore your target is English-speaking international audience all across the world. And therefore, there's really nothing except for you to be competing. And for you to compete, you need to do your work with specific quality, with good production, with good content and attractive content. And that's what has made CGTN one of the most, with its pages on all social media, has tens of millions, in some cases over 100 and 150 million viewers globally. And this is basically the mission of the channel, is to appeal to the international audience.
So then there's a simple question that has to be asked, which is, to what extent do audiences in the Arab world still watch the international media of this sort? I was just in Riyadh last week, and my friends are talking about how nobody's watching Al Jazeera anymore. Everybody gets their news from X. To what extent does anyone care about satellite television news networks anymore?
So satellite news is not, basically whatever you cannot control in terms of what, when, and where is no longer appealing. That's regardless to the content. And I believe it's also what has been, what CGTN has been trying to keep up with. So the focus on social media in the past couple of years has been immense. When we go cover today, the priority goes to social media. So as soon as you reach a location, for example, I was just a few months back in the war in Lebanon, and the directives are, as soon as you go there, let's send social media pics, videos. Let's get people up to date. Let's take them with us across the steps of the trip, for example. So there are more of contents in form of vlogs, more of a post on the internet, and therefore the trend you have to keep up with. But if your question wants to focus on the satellite broadcast of a television network, I don't think it is as followed up by younger generations as it used to be maybe when I was at the same age as a teen, or when I was at studying mass comm, for example, as an undergrad. Back then, even CCTV as an English channel was not, during my first years in university, it was not there yet. And I remember very well when CCTV was launched as CCTV9, the English-speaking channel that is now CGTN English. And in the circle of professors and the mass comm, people were thrilled because, when you give assignments to students, it's like, do like a content analysis between CNN and BBC, but now you have a third significant entity that can provide great analysis when it comes to content analysis, how different it is from the other two. So in that regard, satellite TV or live broadcasts are not as followed up as they have been in the past.
In America, the trend is for viewers to want to see on TV the political perspective that matches their own feelings, their own attitude towards the world. It's all highly partisan, highly biased, and that's what viewers are looking for in a sense. What are viewers looking for in the Arab world? What is it that they're seeking now when they go on the internet or when they go surfing, channel surfing? What is it they're hoping to find?
It is the same. I mean, I would not say it is much different from what you just described in the United States. So most people are looking for affirmations. And that is what many research has been showing us in terms of media content. So you have certain beliefs, specific beliefs, and when you see them affirmed through hosts or channels giving the same messages, you tend to align with them, you feel comfortable, and this is what you follow. So if we want to divide it into like sections, you'd find that the masses would be following what you just described. But the more educated and more languages you have, you would be looking for multiple perspectives. If you're in the business field, for example, you'd definitely be looking for news on CNN, on BBC, on RT, on DW, and on CGTN, because you want to see what's happening from different perspectives. Because at the end of the day, every story has its own angle, right? There's no one way to see the same story. It's how couples, for example, have lots of differences. You would see something from one angle, your spouse would see it from a different angle, and then it's the same thing, but you're seeing it in different ways. The same goes for the global narrative. And many in that very unique and very small number of population would be interested in seeing these differences. And this is where they learn. They will learn what to approach, who to approach, and how to understand exactly how the world is being seen rather than what is being right and what is being wrong, which the masses would be looking for and trying to affiliate themselves with one channel and the other. So I would be looking, if I'm a Republican, I would avoid CNN, I would focus on Fox, and the other way around. And then you'd find scholars, for example, or people with lobbyist political mindset would be watching both Fox and CNN on a regular basis to understand both sides. That's just a very tiny angle to look at it. The same goes for the Arab world. Yeah,
If
sure.
I can interrupt you there, I find that a lot of my friends in the Gulf aren't fully aware of the bias that exists between one American station, another American station, etc. They're not really cognizant or fully savvy into a liberal media bias or a conservative media bias. But I do find that they are very savvy. They are very nuanced in the way that they understand politics in America. A lot of friends in the Gulf were horrified at the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement and what it was doing to American government and American politics. And so many of my friends are fascinated and enthralled by the new conservatism that they see in America and the way that that presents itself in the media as something that can be popularized even for a younger generation with its own figures out in the forefront that take a heroic stance on this, that, and the other thing, but from a conservative standpoint. So my question is then, when viewers look at America, when your station presents America, is there nuance to the way that they understand American politics or not?
Okay, so first of all, we have like CGTN works in different headquarters. So there's CGTN Beijing, there's CGTN Nairobi, there's CGTN Europe, and there's CGTN DC. Okay, that's one of four headquarters or moving around the clock. So you're shifting news coverage across with the sun, basically, moving from one side of the planet to the other. So you always have a team online. And I have to say that you would find, for example, the team in CGTN America are not far off from the media mindset in the United States. They're mostly Americans. There are multinational employees as well. But again, as I told you, there is an audience, right? You have a product and you want to sell it, basically make people watch it in our example. And you want that product to appeal for the people. For example, CGTN for the past few years, they have always participated in the White House Media Award, and they've won actually, they've won a decent sum of these awards. And in a way, it tells you that CGTN wants to speak the same media language that American networks do. And they're actually competing over prizes now. And in several occasions, CGTN would win in specific regards where other media outlets are there. So they're not way off. On the contrary, I believe they are on the same track. They understand who they're competing with and probably doing a very good job at it.
So then I know we're running low on time, but maybe one of the last things we'll ask them. So it sounds like
Sure.
a lot of the perspective of America and the way America is covered and treated, it really does come down to the reporters and the editorial board for the offices in the region, for the regional office. And a lot of that is about how the reporter chooses to present what they present. And therefore you're looking towards the frontline reporters to understand the nuances themselves and to present them in a way that the local audience cares about. The local audience may not care about the ins and outs of any particular policy initiative going on in Washington. They may have different interests, but you're trusting, in a sense, the reporter to understand that level of care, and for the editorial board to be able to translate that into terms that they need for CGTN's purposes. So then, I guess the question I have then, what are the greatest challenges that you face as a reporter in the region, not just representing CGTN, but in general? What are the greatest challenges that you face as someone who knows the region very well, who is from the region, who's done this for a very long time?
Yeah. So as a person working for CGTN, I have to say I have not faced any challenges when it comes from that regard. I mean, you're Chinese media. I always find doors are opened. Clearances, in the Arab world, clearances and media clearances are very complicated measures that you have to go through, and the red tape around them are a lot to handle. So in that regard, beyond that, I mean, you would not find challenges. You find like your paperworks are going. I've been to most parts of the Arab world. Out of the 22 countries, I'd say maybe I've covered in about 16, 17 of them. And I have not found challenges covering there. CGTN has been welcomed in the Palestinian occupied territories. It's been welcome to cover in Israel. It's been welcome to cover in Qatar, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and UAE, you name it. So from that perspective, it is not restricting at all. But what is, I mean, what challenges we face in working in the Arab world is that there is a lot of paperwork for you to do to get your job done. There are a lot of clearances that you have to go through to have your job done. For you to take a camera and film it in the street, it is something noticeable. It is something that commonly you would find a security personnel coming to you, asking for permits and verifying that you have valid permits that cover the date and the place where you're filming from. So that's and it's not one country in specific. That's basically the general trend. While if you have a camera in other countries outside the Arab world, um, you would feel like you do not stand out when you have a camera and filming in the street. So that's the main issue, and you would find that trickle down to not only security personnel, but even regular citizens. If you're passing by, people would like, so what channel are you from? During the peak of the political tension between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar, Al Jazeera was greatly frowned upon. So people would ask you, "Are you from Al Jazeera?" Okay, and like they look prepared to report to the local police, for example. So yeah, so that's the sense of what you're working with. And as a television journalist in the region, you're very noticeable, and it is frequently a part of maybe our daily job is whenever we film in the street to verify our credentials almost every time we are in open space in the region. And as I said, it does not. I mean, no country is excluded from that. Even the most liberal countries in the region would still require, filming permits and make sure that you have them.
Let me ask one last question then before we close it
Sure.
out. What was your favorite story to cover in all of your years?
um, Favorite story to cover. Favorite stories, I mean, is a topic a bit challenging. So here's the thing by being a television journalist or a journalist in general. I remember the first class as an undergrad. A professor came at AUC and then she told us, be prepared. From now on, you're going to live on the miseries of other people. And to a great extent, that's basically what news coverage is, right? So there's a port explosion in Beirut during a pandemic, sorry, and no travel. You have to find a way, to travel, reach Lebanon, and go cover a port explosion during this very critical time, 2020. There is a war in Lebanon. You have to pack your bags, go again. There's a war in Libya. You have to pack your bags and go. People are basically fleeing in one direction, and you're just moving against the stream to reach that location where they're fleeing from. But I have to say, the port incident in Lebanon was very interesting because, first of all, Lebanon in general, it is always an interesting country to work in because of the multi-layered cultural differences and religious differences that is ongoing there. There was a political aspect going with a government division. There is an accumulated economic crisis, on top of which there is a global pandemic affecting the economy, and the port explosion basically, maximized the economic pressure on the country. My favorite story in that part is that I came out with a story of a totally different angle about how the fashion industry in Lebanon was affected, by what was going on. Because Lebanon is very famous in the Arab world for fashion. It's also one of the most influential. Lebanese designers are some of the most influential, even in the fashion capital in France, in Paris. And during that time, the Paris Fashion Week was just like a couple of weeks coming in, and not all, but at least the top Lebanese fashion designers, they had their headquarters by the sea, looking over the port, and like their buildings collapsed, the facade were shattered, their designs that they were preparing for the Paris Fashion Week all went away, and the fashion industry in Lebanon is quite significant. So it's a story that you would not really feel that it is a time to talk about it when there is a pandemic, an economic crisis, and a port that has just exploded. But somehow was embedded because it summarizes what Lebanon was about, a struggling economy with one of its strongest assets, fashion, being critically affected during its peak season, basically the Paris Fashion Week, because of a port explosion coming on a pandemic during an economic crisis and a political division.
Okay, well, we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Adel Mahrouky.
Thank
I
you.
can't thank
Thank
you
you.
enough.